I have to bring the microphone down after Kristen Kish. Thank you so much, Vivian. And thank you, HJ and Teresa and all of my friends at KoreanAmericanStory.org. I'm so moved to be here tonight and to be in this room and to see so many of my dearest friends. So, I'm Korean American. I have many stories. So actually my challenge over the last few weeks, and like Kristen, it was a lot of procrastination, but I was trying to call down what is my story and what can I share with you tonight that would be meaningful. So I was thinking about the time that I first came to America when I was 6 years old with my family. We moved to the suburbs of Washington, D.C., and I remember starting first grade in a strange school in this place called America. And I quickly learned to dread that first question that everyone asks. What's your name? My name, Yoon Kyung B, which had worked just fine in Korea, was now a label that just confirmed how alien, how other I was. I remember my older sister and the look in her 8-year-old eyes while we would wait for the school bus every morning, with kids who would take her beautiful name, Kyung B, and mutilate it into taunts of chunky and chinky. And my name, Kyung Bok, became Kyung Butt because, bullies are so creative. It was hard being the only Asian kids in school. So one day, I decided to take matters into my own hands and change my name. And I decided my name would be Karen, which had such a nice American ring to it. It was nothing official. I simply started answering Karen Yoon when people asked me my name. And that name stuck all the way through high school. But fast forward into the 1990s when I got my first break on television as a news reporter on Channel 5 right here in New York. And I spent some time thinking long and hard before finally deciding to go with my television moniker of Kyung Yoon. And this was against the advice of my news director and other well-meaning friends who said, Karen Yoon, that sounds more telegenic and TV-friendly kind of name. But I thought back to when I was growing up, and what a difference it would have made to my 6-year-old self if I could have turned on the TV and seen someone with a name like mine, and how I would have felt a little less other. But also, I thought maybe those kids who bullied my sister and me wouldn't have been so quick to make fun of a name that they're seeing on TV. So that was the beginning of Kyung Yoon, Fox 5 News. And being the first Korean American broadcast reporter in New York, and because my name was so unmistakably Korean, it stirred up interest in the community. And once I started appearing nightly on TV, I remember being interviewed by Korean newspapers and magazines and other media. And in those days when I'd be out on the streets covering a story with a camera crew and a microphone, actually what I'd hear the most was, "Hey, Connie Chung!" But Korean Americans would make a point of coming up to me, and like Kristen's story, for some reason it was mostly the ajummas, and they would take my hand and look me in the eyes, and I remember they would say, "Kyung Yoon, we're so proud of you." And being embraced by my Korean American community surprised me, but it also felt really good. I hadn't grown up in New York, but a job like mine was a crash course in New York City 101. Within a year, I knew all 5 boroughs like the back of my hand as I covered fires and protests, shootings, and scandals. It made me get proximate to what was happening in the city. The early 90s was a time of extreme racial tensions in New York, and Korean Americans were a part of it. Many Korean immigrants who couldn't afford to open a Korean corner grocery store in, say, Manhattan, were setting up small groceries in poor neighborhoods that had mostly people of color as customers. The customers accused the Koreans of being the people who come to our neighborhood, take our money, and give nothing back. It was a stereotyped narrative that I heard over and over, and one that erupted in boycotts of Korean-owned grocery stores by African Americans, and across the country, the LA riots of 1992. So I remember covering a lot of these stories with a sense of frustration and feeling that we Korean Americans needed to do something to change that narrative, but we had so little voice and visibility. In addition to my professional life, my volunteer work brought me proximate to issues in the Asian American community. For many years, I served as the board chair of the New York Asian Women's Center, now called Womankind, an organization that supports women and children affected by domestic violence in New York's Asian communities. So in the early 2000s, our board and staff worked really hard to fundraise and open a much-needed place of safety and shelter for women in a quiet residential neighborhood. But when the neighbors got wind of a shelter for Asian women on their block, they mounted a vicious and racist campaign to stop us. A house full of Asian women, well, that has to be a front for a brothel. Or, all that Chinese food and garbage, it's gonna bring vermin to the neighborhood. Those were just some of what was said. And in a tactic that was so ugly that it would draw national media attention, many of the residents actually started a flyer campaign that read, "Stop the shelter at," and then gave our address, violating our paramount need for confidentiality when it comes to the safety of abuse victims. I remember someone left a dead rat in a box on our doorstep, and we received a threat that the house would burn if we moved in. So we decided that we couldn't possibly put women and children coming out of their own fresh trauma into this shelter. And instead, in the first few weeks, we decided that the board and staff would take turns sleeping there, posing as clients. So that's how, one winter day, I found myself on the subway holding the hand of my then 8-year-old son as the two of us headed to sleep at the shelter. I remember feeling the gaze of the neighborhood residents as we walked from the subway to the doorsteps of the shelter. I also remember the warmth of the shelter staff who greeted me and my son and took us to our room. The room had a bunk bed, and my son immediately scrambled up on the top. And I remember lying on the bottom bed and listening to my son breathing peacefully as he slept. And as I lay there, I thought about all the women who would be coming after me in this room, lying in this bed, and finally being able to sleep, knowing that they are safe, and listening to the breathing of their own children sleeping peacefully. And it became so clear to me why we had resisted the racist NIMBY neighbors and why we had taken on the uphill work of fundraising for this shelter. And it made me more committed than ever to making sure that small grassroots organizations that struggle to create safety and security for the most vulnerable in our community, and who perennially struggle for funding for this work, that they need to be supported. That's why in 2002, I helped to start the Korean American Community Foundation to get more resources to nonprofits helping low-income neighbors in our community, and also to organize our Korean American collective philanthropy. Ultimately, it was our way to challenge and change that narrative that Korean Americans are takers and not givers. You know, once I heard a beautiful quote about living a successful life, that it involves climbing, but also lifting as we climb. And it made me think that Korean Americans, we're really good at climbing. We're climbing to that best school, and to that next job. But maybe because so many of us are immigrants or children of immigrants who are just focused on surviving in this country, we actually aren't so well equipped on how we lift as we climb. So at the heart of my life's work and my values and the way I see the world as a Christian, as a mom, and a community leader, it's about the lifting, and especially of those who are left behind. And we all know that when we lift together, it's not so heavy. And I want to thank so many of you in this room who are leaders and supporters of KACF. But I need to recognize one person in particular, and that's my husband, George. You have lifted me up every step of every day of our marriage. And as we're celebrating our 30th anniversary this year, I want to thank you, George, for being my foundation and for always making me feel so deeply understood and supported and loved. Thank you. So in closing, I just have to share with you something that happened to me some years ago when I was visiting my friend who lives in Maryland, and her kids were in elementary school at that time in Bethesda. And I sat down with her son to help him with his homework. And I opened up his Bethesda Public School issued math book. And on the first page, it read, Kyung has 5 apples. If Kyung eats 2 apples, how many apples will Kyung have? And this brought me back full circle to when I was a first grader, when I would have never dreamed that a name like Kyung or Mohammed, and not just Jack or Jill, could be in a textbook. And why it's important to put our names and our perspectives out there unapologetically, and not to have to keep seeing the world colored by the dominant frame. And I want to thank you, KoreanAmericanStory.org, for changing the frame and giving all of us a chance to tell our own stories in our own voices. Thank you so much.